we just talk loud? Can you hear us in the back?
No, Kate's grabbing you.
I think our mic's coming. Well, let's just get started. That was her impression message. That is not, I think, oh, you're coming here. I think it was a very prescient message you shared there that we're just not hearing in a constructive way from most elected officials. How old are you right now?
37.
37. I'm turning 40 in just a little over a month, and it's finally dawned. I'm used to being like the young guy in the room when I was... Who are you? I'm Derek Fildebrandt. I'm a publisher of the Western Standard. Thank you. I was elected as a pretty young guy when I got into politics. 29, I was by far the youngest member of the Wild Rose Caucus. I'm used to being the young guy in the room, and I tried hard not to be the token young guy. But I think there is this is one of, I think, going to develop to be one of the defining issues of our time. You touched on a lot of it. I want to maybe suss it out a bit more here. We'll just start maybe on the electoral level when we get, then we'll get a bit deeper. In the most recent US presidential election, young men skewed strongly for Trump. Now there's very often, normally been some gender divide at least. Males skew right, females skew left, obviously with a lot of exceptions to that, but in the aggregate. So we saw it in the United States, particularly among young people. We remember white dudes for Harris was amongst the Democrats at least started to recognize they had a problem at least. They just did it pretty terribly how they went about it. We saw in the most recent federal election in Germany, the AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, kind of the insurgent right party, young men skewed hard to the AfD. Young women skewed hard to Die Linke, which means in German, the left. And it's that party, I pretty casually call everybody a commie, but these guys are the actual commies. They're actually a formal successor party to the East German Communist Party. So people, what do you think is causing the electoral and partisan divergence among young men and young women? There's a lot of issues facing young women. Some of them are similar or even the same, but some are different, and this is manifesting itself in a partisan and an electoral way. What do you think is driving that divide?
Yeah, generally speaking, I think the average person votes because they believe, rightly or wrongly, that a particular political party or a particular political leader is going to have their interests in mind. And I think when you look at the divergence in voting habits between young men and young women in some of these studies, what I sort of interpret that as is evidence that a lot of women might feel like the right-wing political parties are not offering solutions to things they care about, and a lot of young men would feel the same way about left-wing political parties. I also think, though, that the real core problem, though, is a lack of confidence in the solutions being offered. So I don't think a man or a woman or any person is going to say, I think you have a solution to my problem, but I'm voting for someone else anyway. I think they're not sold on the solutions being provided. And in my job, I think that's sort of our responsibility, is how do we figure out how to convince people that conservative ideas, conservative policies would actually lead to a better quality of life for as many people as possible. I think that's how you win elections, and I think that's also what our task is.
I think one of the common themes of what you talked about is neglect. Neglect and perhaps even hostility. You talked about the hierarchy of victimhood. Without getting into it, it's almost there's the point card. You add up, and how many points you have determines how high on the pyramid of victimhood you are. and we as a society, a broad Western civilization, have for some time now fetishized victimhood, that you want to be a victim. And that seems to be antithetical, I think, to the founding values of Western civilization, is even if you are a victim, you fight to not be a victim. The ultimate goal is to liberate oneself, to achieve a personal freedom for your own society. But the fetishization of victimhood, I think, has led to these destructive outcomes. And I think for young men in particular, they sit through high school, it begins even in elementary school, I think. But then, you get to universities, and they're just constantly bombarded with, here are the victims, and therefore the good groups, and here are the oppressors, therefore the bad groups. And if you are constantly told and reinforced that you are the oppressor, that can't help but color things. How do you think that is driving the psyche of young men in our society right now, who have been told constantly that you're an oppressor and you're victimizing some other group, yet they're looking at their own circumstances? They're unemployed or they're underemployed, they're living at home, they have no prospect of home ownership. The dating world is changing in strange ways that are not good for most men. That's how is that how is that disconnect, I think, going to manifest itself over the next decade?
Yeah. Well, I think this is something that everybody can relate to, which is, imagine, you have a problem and you go to someone to try to explain it, and they tell you, well, because of what you look like or where your parents come from, your problem isn't actually a real problem, right? Like, you're calling an airline company to say that you canceled my flight and I need it to be rescheduled, and they tell you, what color are you? And if you're not the right color, then actually you don't need a new flight, right? It's a very personal thing that everyone can relate to. The idea that you are somehow your perspective, your concerns are being watered down and undermined by virtue of things that have nothing to do with decisions you've made or things that you've done as a human being. And I think that's how a lot of young men in particular feel, which is that they are going through a series of challenges in our economy, in our culture, and feeling that by raising those concerns, they are actually being further marginalized and dismissed, because by virtue of even speaking about it, they are now somehow committing a new offense, right? So I think that it puts a lot of people in a very unsustainable position culturally. And in response, you're going to see people get frustrated and look for alternatives. The pull that conservatives have had for young men is in large part, I think, because we are offering something different. The status quo is not working. And there is, in Canada and a lot of Western democracies, there is very little daylight between a lot of the political options being provided. And so when you're looking at the series of ideas being presented to you to solve your problems, whether some of the things I mentioned, opioids, unemployment, education, all of these different things, and everybody sounds the same. Your teachers, your professors, the stuff you've been told to read, the mainstream media, everybody sounds the exact same. You want to feel like something new is possible, and that is where conservatives have been able to offer an alternative to a lot of young men who are frustrated with the status quo. And I think that's a strength that we have, but we also then have a responsibility to follow through on that, right? It cannot just be a rhetorical difference. It has to be that we are taking the time to put the effort in to actually solve your problems, and not take for granted the people who are coming to us and asking us to listen to them and work with them in favor of chasing some mythical, voter or stakeholder or constituent that might not even be there in the first place.
So I think a lot of this, there's a incredible backlash taking place. And it's not just among young men, it's society at large. We could see on some social issues where the progressivist left overreached itself so far, and now there's backlash. You think of transgender ideology 5 years ago. if you said anything at all, you'd be pilloried as an ism or a phobe of some kind. And now the backlash to that, is driving the political right across the Western civilization right now. But I think it's particularly strong with young men. That overreach is, I think, has developed into a sense of rage, of a need to settle the score almost, and this can go in a few different directions potentially. It can go in the direction of nihilism, a loss of sense of agency, that you can't do anything about it, and I'm therefore, as you said, going to just check out. They're not going to work. They're going to watch porn instead of have a family. They're going to live with their parents forever instead of have a home. They'll collect welfare rather than work. It could take the direction of nihilism and accepting a loss of sense of personal, individual agency. It could manifest itself in a fairly mainstream conservative direction, where they vote for parties that might move things in their direction. But I think it also has a potential to go in a more radical direction that we're seeing, and that a lot of that's maybe driven by some of the new online right. Which direction, broadly speaking, for some people there's all three paths, maybe some others I'm not including. Where do you think it's likely to go out of those three broad paths? I could take a guess at which I think you would hope it goes down, but how is it that you would want to see, say, the Conservative Party of Canada, the Conservative movement more broadly, try to drive them down the mainstream conservative political path rather than checking out in the direction of nihilism or radicalizing in the other direction?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I think any of us here who are familiar with, kind of the evolution of conservative politics over a prolonged period of time, we have typically taken the position of emphasizing personal responsibility, personal autonomy, work hard, make good choices, you will get ahead. And as the economy has gotten tougher for people, as social mobility has become more and more difficult, as the cost of a house has become more unreachable for people, the sort of traditional message of, well, just work hard and it's kind of on your shoulders, you figure it out, it frankly is just tougher to deliver, in part because it's less reflective of the reality that a lot of young Canadians are growing up in. And I think in an ideal world, that is the balance we want to get back to, where the economy works well enough, where society works well enough, where our institutions work well enough, where we have the confidence that we can say, if you work hard and make good choices, you will get ahead. That is what an ideal society looks like, in my view, and that is the position that conservative politics has been in for most of my lifetime. The challenge right now is that we have now environmental and structural issues that have sort of piled up and do require some fixing before I think we can say with confidence to a young person, you're in a country where working hard is going to be enough to get you a good quality of life. That is just not true right now, and we need to make that true again. Until that is true again, I do think we have to be concerned about some of the things you mentioned as far as people giving up. But equally, we also have to be concerned with people becoming overly consumed with resentment. This is a very toxic response that lots of people can have to feeling that life is unfair, the opportunities aren't available, they're not able to get ahead, feel like they're being held back. And when resentment breeds in that kind of environment, that is where you do see things like extremism, racism, people starting to feel that it is warranted to blame groups of people instead of individuals, or and the new right, as you sort of described it online. I mean, you will see lots of that out there, right? People who are trying to teach our young men to be resentful, to engage in tribal politics, to be hateful as a way to feel like they can respond to their circumstances. And we have to be able to show that there is a constructive way to be unhappy and frustrated, but that things can get better. And I think that's the task in front of us. I don't say this as if it is easy. I certainly don't say this as if I have that all figured out and I can just sort of lay out for you a plan for how to deal with it. But I think that is ultimately what we're trying to solve for right now. And if we can keep young people feeling that there is hope, that to be involved, to feel like there is some relationship between the effort they put in and outcomes getting better, then I think we can steer them away from some of the more destructive ways of reacting to their circumstances.
I'm not going to be an optimist on this one. I think there's going to be, people are going to go in those three streams: nihilism, checking out, some going the mainstream direction, hoping for change, and then others radicalizing. I think there's going to be more of the first and last option than we would expect. Because I think a lot of us think things are too far gone to actually be fixed. We have had a decade of totally open borders, and even before that, on the conservative immigration policy, it was relatively open borders policy, but it was better. It was justifiable. You could at least make a case for it. All right. Our debt, especially cumulative federal, provincial, municipal debt, our national debt is there's no prospect of ever paying it back, except Alberta, because we're Alberta. But our per capita GDP is now lower than Italy. Now, this might be anti-Italianism on my part, but I've always drawn the line between first and second world at, are you richer or poorer than Italy? If you were Italy or poorer, you're first world. And if you're one country poorer than Italy, you're now second world. Canada, by my old definition, is technically the richest second world country in the world. Sorry, Italians. But actually, good on you. You're richer than Canada. I'm not sure if that's because Italy did anything right or just because Canada's done everything wrong at the same time. Where's Tristan Hopper? I think he's got something about that. We've seen in a remarkably short period of time just what our communities look like change before our eyes. I work in the Western Standards offices are in downtown Calgary. There are drug zombies everywhere. Broken, crushed souls. The demographic makeup has changed, not slowly and with integration and assimilation, but radically, right in front of us. And so I think there's a sense, even among, if I can include myself in this group, the more rational and clear-minded of us, that things are too broken. It can't be fixed anymore, that we're really just kind of on borrowed time, that this is the sunset of Western, not just Canada, but of Western civilization, that we're in some kind of sunset, that, the term used in the news business is managed decline, and that we're just going to enjoy it for as long as we can, and will eventually just kind of disappear, that there's no long-term sense of continuity even for our civilization anymore, and we're just going to enjoy the ride we're going to ride on the fumes while it lasts. So I'm not an optimist. I don't know, you're in elected politics, you have to believe that things can maybe be fixed, but I don't know. Is there much to that? And if so, I think that's going to increase the pull of those who want to check out on one side or those who want to radicalize on the other.
William Buckley used to tell this joke that he felt if he picked 20 random names from the phone book, he would find 20 better people suited to run his country than picking 20 names from the Harvard faculty. And I am inclined to kind of look at it that way. And what I mean by that is that, in my job, I have the privilege of being able to talk to a lot of Canadians who, most people never get the chance to meet, right? They're busy, working, and then they're home and they're cooking dinner for their family and they're taking their kid to soccer practice, and they don't come to, public events. They're not on social media. Journalists don't interview them. Their perspective would never really be accounted for. And it's probably the best part of my job, to be honest, is that I get to hear from those Canadians and I get to knock on their door and have a conversation. And I think part of my optimism, a lot of it comes from those interactions, which is that I do believe that the average Canadian is a highly capable person with a good head on their shoulders. And I think our institutions don't reflect our people. So the challenge I feel every day is, how do we get that to line up better, right? How do we get to feel that, like, the sensible Canadian is actually the person making decisions that affect large swaths of our population from a policy perspective. And I don't have the kind of magic answer to that, but I do think, because I think the people are there, it makes me feel a little bit more optimistic that we have more of an institutional problem than a country problem. It's not our people, it's not necessarily even our culture, it's the institutions that serve us that have failed, and those institutions, I think, can be reformed.
I'd be inclined more to agree if this wasn't an endemic problem right across the Western world, though. I mean, this is not a uniquely Canadian problem. The Americans have it, the Brits, the French, the Germans. It's pretty broad. Now, a lot of these institutions have the same kind of ideological capture in them. They have a lot of the same problems. So perhaps so, but it is not a uniquely Canadian problem. We've even got it here in Alberta to a large extent, just maybe less so than other parts of Canada. But I guess I'd come back to it again. In the last federal election, I already thought it was probably kind of too late to save Canada, to save our very privileged position in the world as a safe, stable, prosperous liberal democracy. Best case scenario, you get to start the work in 4 years from now. Best case scenario, If it's not too late now, will it not be too late 4 years from now to be able to turn this around? I know, I'm Mr. Sunshine this morning.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can speak for me personally on this, and this is obviously a complicated thing in terms of how do you decide to be optimistic about the future of our country. Everyone's going to kind of have a different perspective on that. I believe in God, and I'm a Christian, and my faith comes in part from believing that unlikely things happen, that good things happen in spite of tremendous adversity, and that it's always worth trying. And so that would be my message to someone who maybe feels the way you do, is like, I'm not going to fight with you on this, but I am going to say I think we need you and we need you to try, and I hope you do.
Well, since I'm in the media, I'm going to take you out of context. I'll take you out of context and say that the only thing that'll save Canada is a miracle. Or maybe that's a fair headline. Okay, I want to continue to move in the direction of where this is going socially and politically with young men, maybe focusing on the online right. You referenced William F. Buckley, one of the pillars of the modern conservative movement. The Weekly Standard in its day was largely able, it played such a dominant role among the intelligentsia of the conservative movement that it could put fences around and say, this is acceptable within the broader coalition, and outside here be dragons. I don't think there's any institution, media or otherwise, that is able to do so now in a decentralized media environment where social media platforms have, I think generally for better, been decensored and are able to speak more freely. But that means you're going to see more fringe voices come in. And the fringe is no, I'm not sure if we can call it that fringe anymore. These ideas are becoming more mainstream. People might not necessarily agree with actually even what they're listening to, but they like the edginess of it, that like it's the forbidden fruit that they get to eat. Before we came up here, we talked about like Nick Fuentes. I didn't even know about this guy a year ago. I never even heard of him. Now you scroll for 5 minutes, it's going to come up, and it's some crazy shit. But I think a lot of people, they might not even agree with anything he's saying, but the guys like him are breaking taboos that an entire generation was brought up saying you can't say this, you can't even think it in any way for very mainstream things like just basic liberal democratic principles that were considered now taboos. We call you a phobe of this, or an ist, or ism of that. And so there's a taboo breaking in this that I think is alluring to a lot of people. And it could go one of several ways, but where do you think this is going with the influence of the new really, really hard or extreme right and its influence on young men?
Yeah. Okay, so some of you might remember sort of the political dynamics around race in the late 80s, early 90s, where you had figures like Louis Farrakhan, for example, emerge and gain significant followings by saying to mostly black men who were frustrated with their circumstances, couldn't get ahead, dealing with a whole host of problems in their communities, that they needed to blame white people for their misfortunes. What we're seeing now is that same strategy be employed to appeal to disenfranchised young white men. And instead of Farrakhan telling a black man to blame white people, it's now someone like Nick Fuentes telling young white men on Rumble to blame the Jewish community, right? But the playbook is the same. And I think that's kind of the story of extremism, is people encouraging resentment toward a particular group to help explain why your life is the way that it is when you're unhappy. Louis Farrakhan failed. You don't really hear about him anymore. His organization doesn't exist the same way. And partly why, not the only reason, but partly why he failed is that black people started doing better in society. There were more opportunities, not only to get an education, but also to get a job. There was better assimilation, integration of different cultures. We started to move in a direction where race no longer was a predictor of your social outcomes in the same way that it was in the 80s and the early 90s when Farrakhan was at his peak. And I think that's probably how we defeat, the likes of Nick Fuentes also, is that we actually have to stop giving him the same type of audience by making people feel like there is a way to get ahead. The problem of social mobility is, in my view, one of the biggest things that we really have to wrap our heads around, which is that the integrity of your society is in many ways based on the idea that there's enough of a meritocracy that people born into difficult circumstances can escape those circumstances. And people are just losing faith in that. And when they lose faith in that, there will be, weirdos on the internet who want them to hate a certain religious group or racial group as a way to feel like they're doing something, but it is toxic and it gets you nowhere. And I think that there's a lot of history we can point to of that going badly, obviously, but there's also history we can point to of that being defeated, and I think that's what we should be trying to do.
One of the drivers of political change is often when a feeling of social mobility, when the American dream, as it were, feels out of reach for people, they can't move up. That often results in fairly significant political change. Revolution often comes when people believe that social mobility is potentially downwards, that people could fall out of the middle classes into the lower classes, or even from upper classes into middle classes. And I think that is something that is defining our era right now, is that for the first time, we have a generation that is likely to have, in the aggregate, a lower standard of living and lower overall happiness in the outcomes of their life by the key metrics of having a good family, family life, social clubs. We have no social clubs anymore. Maybe some people with grayish hair in here still play bridge with their friends, but we don't have social clubs in any meaningful sense anymore. We don't have social networks, at least in person. We've lost sense of meaning between people, but our overall standard of living, major measurements of happiness in life, for the first time, possibly since the Industrial Revolution, are likely to be lower than that of our parents. And so I think there's a real fear of downward social mobility. And I think that creates potentially revolutionary circumstances, not just in Canada again, but across the broader West. So you said, the way, organizations like the guy you're mentioning with the Black Power movement was marginalized in the late 80s, early 90s, was by creating a sense of upward social mobility among Black Americans. I guess the scary question is the flip side. What if we can't reestablish the sense of upward social mobility among young men again? If they see in their real life circumstances that the social mobility in our society is downward.
Yeah, I think that you nailed it. That is a very important question. And this is one of the reasons why I am grateful that the conversation about immigration policy has become more mainstream now than it was even 6 or 12 months ago. And I do hope that it continues to move in a constructive direction, because this is precisely where I think these questions of what the future looks like, we are affecting this question on a regular basis. If you are in an environment where opportunity is more scarce and yet you're bringing in more people and you're growing your population, it is a recipe for downward social mobility. It's just, it's inevitable. And I will be honest with you, I am very frustrated that it has taken this long for mainstream political discourse to acknowledge that we are hurting our country with such a high volume of people coming in. It should have been a logical, easy thing to talk about, and yet in part because of the sort of desire to make immigration a question of race, people they were so afraid to engage that it got so bad to where it is now before we started to have a serious debate about the topic. And but this is why it's important. We have to think about opportunity as a scarce resource, because it is one, and that every decision we make about how many people come into the country, how those opportunities are distributed, what social programs exist to incentivize opportunities being distributed in one direction or another, all of these things are how you shape and manufacture the quality of life for people. And we have been, frankly, collectively in this country, asleep at the wheel for a long time. So the questions about downward social mobility are real. I do think they can be fixed. It's a question whether we have the fortitude to do it. But I think that one very natural place to start on that would be massive reduction in new people entering the country.
All right, let's switch gears a bit. I think to a lot of people who are not hardcore political watchers, you were introduced to the country on election night. You know where I'm going. I had some of my reporters in the back there. I got one from Ontario, Jeremy Borg. He said, "You gotta ask Jamil about his election night teardown to Doug Ford." So I want to ask you about your good friend Dougie. In Ontario, conservative audience might be a bit more split on the matter, and maybe there's some Doug fans in here. No, so I said no. I think it's going to be less so. Polyev conservatism has got a bit more of a home field advantage here in southern Alberta than Doug Ford would be. I'm pretty familiar with kind of the weird factionalism of Ontario conservatism. We have our own factionalism here in Alberta. But in Ontario, it's mirroring in many ways kind of the split that eventually emerged between the Alberta Progressive Conservative Party and the Conservative Party of Canada, where the Conservative Party of Canada was actually more conservative than the Alberta Progressive Conservative Party. And my sincere apologies to the good ones who were in the PC party fighting the good fight at that time. But you had Thomas Lukaszuk and Alison Redford fighting against Stephen Harper, Kenny, and these guys. How serious does that split between, say, the Ford PCs and the Polyev federal conservatives, does it pose any major threat to the viability of the Conservative Party, particularly in Ontario, which one has to win if it's to have any chance of forming a majority government?
Yeah, so first off, I am a proud Ontario boy, so I feel the need to defend my province a little bit here and point out that Pierre Poilievre got 1 million more votes in Ontario than Doug Ford did. Wasn't enough for us to win as many seats as we wanted, of course, but people did show up for Pierre in Ontario in a way that I think we can be proud of. And yeah, it's interesting you point this out. So I don't know a ton about the divide you're talking about between the Alberta PCs and the federal party at that time. But I would say this is less of an ideological problem and more of a what is the point of politics problem. Okay, so let me explain what I mean. I don't think Doug Ford or the people in his administration believe they have an ideology. I don't believe they have come to a rational conclusion that there's a better way to be a conservative than what I or you would say. In fact, I'm not even sure they would be capable of having a conversation about conservative ideas or principles. What I think is more of the issue is there are people who think the goal of politics is to have power and maintain power for as long as possible at whatever cost is required to pay. And there are people who want to do politics because they believe in certain values or ideas or changes that they would like to create. And to me, that is the difference in Ontario between a lot of the people who are, who are our candidates and myself. I don't want to speak for other people. So I'll say that's the difference between me and the difference between Doug Ford. It's weird when you talk to someone, as you might if you spend time with people in the current incarnation of Ford Nation. And they think that because someone put a good poll out for them, that you're supposed to be happy. Like, oh, you got a good poll. I guess that's good. And not to diminish the fact that that's a reality of our business, like we need to get public support. But if you're popular but you're not doing good things, why am I supposed to be happy about that? Yes. And to be perfectly honest, I also question, whether the negative effect of that is producing more cynicism among our people, right? If people think politicians don't believe in anything and they're not going to do anything, and regardless of what color your jersey is, you're going to have the same approach to big, important issues, then you're making a lot of people feel like politics isn't even worth getting involved in the first place. You're making a lot of people feel like making the time to vote is not worth it in the first place. And that is my biggest concern among anything as it relates to Doug Ford, is that is what he's doing to our people in Ontario and ventures to do to our people across the nation, I think, if he had his way. So that is what bothers me and why I was so amped up on election night is because for weeks and weeks, I had been seeing volunteers putting their effort in to trying to help win this federal election. Kids who've never voted before, single moms making time after her shift to come and knock on doors, people who are giving everything they had. And when they would open up their phones and see stories of the so-called Conservative Premier of Ontario trashing what we were doing, they felt discouraged. And they deserve someone to speak up for them and tell this guy, I don't care about how, about your theatrics and your stunts. I don't respect you, and I'm going to point it out because I don't like what you're doing to the people who are trying to fight for a better country. That was the point I had to make.
All right, well, we're only 1 minute over time, so I think that's a good time for a mic drop.
All right.
Thank you, Jamil.